Welcome. This talk is one of about 200 on the history of Western art, and I proceed chronologically from cave art to the present day, and I try to avoid imposing any overarching ideology. I see art history as a reflection of the artist's engagement with the local social and political circumstances and the evolving artistic preferences and styles of the period. Now, this talk, which is on the destruction of British art, is not a talk that I give with pleasure, as it involves possibly the greatest loss of British art, and also because of the depth at which I cover it, there's a lot to cover, and so it's quite a long talk. Now, we don't know how much religious art was in churches before the Reformation, but English churches and cathedrals were probably similar to those in the rest of Europe. So it's highly likely that they were covered in images, brightly coloured, full of wall paintings, statues of religious figures and so on. One difference, though, is unlike the rest of Europe, in England, Lollardy was widespread from about 1350, and the Lollards disapproved of idolatry, and although the practice was regarded as heretical, it may have influenced many people, and there's still a fierce debate amongst historians about whether ordinary English people welcomed the Reformation because of the systemic corruption of the Catholic Church, or were slowly dragged from their old established Catholic religious practices into the new Protestant religion. Now, the Reformation did sever Britain's deep cultural links with continental Europe, but the British rejected the extremes of Puritanism, and in fact, one consequence of that was that the Pilgrim Fathers sailed to America in 1620. In the 18th century, the English started to develop an art of the people rather than religious art. For example, the satire of Hogarth, Gilray, to the portraits of Gainsborough and Reynolds. So starting in about 1538, most religious art was destroyed, including some stained glass, which was unusual even in Protestant Europe. The destruction was comprehensive and methodical, and included sculptures, copes, vestments, statues of the Virgin and others, and saints, wood carving, and so on. Some rood screens were not destroyed, but the crosses on them were burnt in the late 16th century. Books were burnt on a vast scale. Of the 600 books in the library of Worcester Priory, only 6 remain, and the Augustinian friars of York had about 646 volumes, and only 3 survive. Music in churches was disapproved of. Music manuscripts were destroyed wholesale. Organs were shattered, destroyed. It's been described as a cultural revolution designed to obliterate England's memory of who and what she had been. The Reformation is sometimes described as opening closed minds, but maybe it should be better described as removing our memory by obliterating our record of the past in order to destroy or fundamentally change our national identity. Some things did remain, of course. It's difficult to say how many works of art remain from medieval England, but the Tate exhibition Image and Idol Medieval Sculpture of 2002 said that some 23 remnants of medieval religious sculpture are all that remain. That excludes tombs, and also it excludes other works like 60 odd medieval wall paintings. But it is estimated that some 90% to some say 99% of all religious art was destroyed. There are some works, as you see here, that did survive: pre-Christian Celtic tombstones, jewellery, such as the Alfred jewel you see here, illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospel of the 7th century, and the stained glass windows, some survived. The great cathedrals themselves, of course, survive, and we have a small number, 60-odd wall paintings, those that were distempered over during the iconoclasm. One of my favourites is the one shown here, a depiction of the Last Judgment, called Doom Paintings, in a small church at Chaldon, Surrey, dating from about 1170. I also have to mention one of the wonders of medieval art that remains, painted at the end of the 14th century. We don't know who the artist was. It's been described as one of the most studied paintings in the history of European art. It shows Richard II being presented to the Virgin Mary on the right, and on behind Richard on the left, from left to right, are St. Edmund the Martyr holding an arrow, St. Edward the Confessor holding a ring, and St. John the Baptist holding a lamb. Note on the right, the angels are all wearing a white heart, which is the emblem of Richard II. It's difficult to pin down exactly the date, but it's round about 1395 to 99. There's also various theories about why it was produced. Some say it was to celebrate his coronation, that's 1377, which was in his 12th year. When he was 11, then there were 11 angels. Others believe that there's a connection with his first wife, Anne of Bohemia. Others point out the rosemary was one of the badges of Anne of Bohemia, but the broom cod collars are an emblem of France, suggesting a date after 1396, when he married his second wife, Isabel, daughter of Charles VI of France. The style of the painting, it's got green underpaint under the flesh, was a technique used by Italians, but Italian artists always used green based on green earth, and the green here is copper-based verdigris. So not quite sure what the conclusion from that is. Another painting that survives from the period is this one. It's in Westminster Abbey. It's a portrait of Richard II. You will see many paintings of kings and queens if you visit country houses in England, but you've got to remember they were all painted hundreds of years later, and the portraits are imaginary. We don't know what most of the kings looked like prior to around 1500, but this is an exception. From Henry VII onwards, all the monarchs had their portraits painted. So, what is iconoclasm and what happened? Well, iconoclasm is a religious belief that images should be destroyed because they're an attempt to copy God's natural world, or because they could be worshipped in their own right. So an image of a saint, the fear was that the worshippers would be worshipping the image rather than the idea of the saint themselves. There's also a criticism made at the time that the church was spending too much money on religious images rather than helping the poor. Now, this belief was supported by the second commandment, and that in Exodus 20 it says, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." Now, the next verse, that was verse 4, verse 5 says, "Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them." And so some people limit the ban on images produced to be worshipped in themselves. So it depends how you interpret those two verses together. Some believe that only likenesses that are made to be worshipped should be banned. Others believe, as was believed at the time in England, all images should be banned. Now, just to explain how this came about, this Protestant Reformation, in 1525, Henry VIII became attracted to Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, who was 9 years younger than Henry, and he began courting her. And by this time, Catherine was too old to bear children. So Henry believed his marriage was cursed and sought confirmation from the Bible, which he interpreted as saying that if a man marries his brother's wife, the couple will be childless. Now, he did marry the Catherine, the wife of his brother Arthur, who died, but Catherine insisted that the marriage had not been consummated and so didn't exist as a marriage. Anyway, Henry's interpretation of the biblical passage meant that he believed the marriage was wrong in the eyes of God, so should be dissolved. And he sent a representative to the Pope, Clement VII, to sue for annulment. But at this time, Clement was a prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, following the sack of Rome in 1527, and he refused to agree. And Henry then asked Thomas Wolsey to solve this great matter, as it was described. An ecclesiastical court was set up, and the Pope, as I said, forbade Henry to marry, and he secretly tried to have Wolsey was secretly tried to have Anne Boleyn exiled, was arrested for treason, but died on his trip down to London. Now, that led to a break with Rome. The Pope excommunicated Henry in 1533. Henry passed the Act of Supremacy in 1534, and that basically gave the king, Henry, supremacy over the church, and he required, or the act required, the nobility to swear an oath recognising Henry's supremacy. And by 1536 he'd broken with Rome, seized the church's assets, declared the Church of England an established church with himself as head. He saw his church in England as being the true Catholic Church. He remained a Catholic all of his life, but he rejected the Pope as the head of the Catholic Church. He saw himself as head of the church. And this is, in 1538, a royal injunction that such feigned images as ye know of in any of your cures, that is parishes, to be so abused with pilgrimage or offering of anything made thereunto, ye shall, for avoiding that most detestable sin of idolatry, forthwith take down and delay, that is, destroy, and shall suffer from henceforth no candles, tapers, or images of wax to be set before any picture, but only the light that commonly goeth across the church. So that was the beginning. Over the course of the next 100 years, the destruction was carried out methodically, so that, as I said, over 90% of all art was destroyed. The most thorough destruction in the world at the time. Yet you'll scarcely see it mentioned in art books or churches. Sometimes it's blamed on Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans, but by that stage, most of the art had already been destroyed. Rood screens, most stained glass windows were smashed. In fact, John Stowe, the Elizabethan antiquarian, said that many Protestants judged every image to be an idol. Now, England had a vibrant visual culture just before the Reformation, and the number of images had increased dramatically because they were a sign of wealth. So wealthy people would be commissioning, funding the creation of images. The word delay, as I said, means destroy, but some, despite the clarity of this injunction, some still regarded it as ambiguous. And to begin with, many thought that images could remain as long as they weren't worshipped. I should also add that most tombs were left intact at this stage, but tombs of saints were destroyed particularly during the interregnum of Oliver Cromwell. This tomb, for example, of Lady Burleigh and her daughter in Westminster Abbey survived the interregnum, perhaps because it doesn't contain any religious images. Now, Edward VI and the Pope, this is from 1568, and the Reformation Parliament in 1531 declared all English clergy guilty of treason unless they purchased a pardon for the offence of having given allegiance to a foreign power, namely the Pope. Nevertheless, despite the fact that most did sign up, in 1536 the monasteries were dissolved, 550 religious buildings seized, 7,000 monks and nuns removed from their living quarters. Now, by 1540, Henry VIII thought reform had gone too far, and Henry VIII had images in the royal chapel and an altar filled with images of saints. But in 1547 he died, was succeeded by his son Edward and Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, and they were much more extreme. That is, much more iconoclastic than Henry had ever been. And this image here, Edward VI and the Pope, an allegory of the Reformation, is an Elizabethan work of propaganda showing how the power had been handed to Henry VIII, who is the person dying in bed, and he had passed on this power, heading up the church, to Edward VI, who we see seated beneath a cloth of state, with the Pope slumped at his feet with his neck broken by a falling Bible. In the top right of the picture you can just make out men pulling down and smashing idols. Alongside Edward is his uncle, the Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, and members of the Privy Council are sitting there. And this is Edward's injunction of 1547, so the year he became king. Also, that they shall take away, utterly extinct, and destroy all shrines, coverings of shrines, all tables, candlesticks, trindles or rolls of wax, pictures, paintings, and all other monuments of feigned miracles, pilgrimages, idolatry and superstition, so that there remain no memory of the same in walls, glass, windows, or elsewhere within their churches or houses, and they shall extort their parishioners to do the like within their several houses. So this injunction was much more sweeping than Henry's. It basically says all images must be destroyed, and destroying stained glass wasn't even done in the rest of Protestant Europe. And note that it even includes people's private houses. Even this injunction, though, was interpreted by some as meaning only images that were idolatrous. So the following year, 1548, it was further clarified that in fact it did mean all images, and 1548 was the year of mass destruction. So what remains today from before that period is a result of laxity, sending images abroad, burying them, bricking them up, hiding them. So let's look at the few images that remain. First, there's a few fragments of statues that remain. Remember, every church had a crucifix above the rood screen, which was the screen that separated the laity in the nave from the high altar and choir in the chancel. Mass, of course, was said in Latin at the high altar by the clergy. The laity often stood. Sometimes they sat on benches in the nave. Men were normally on the south side and women on the north side, or sometimes men were at the front and women at the back. By the Tudor period, most churches had some seating for parishioners, and it was just the beginning of introducing family pews, which had the side effect of breaking down the division between men and women. Although most of the services were in Latin, parishioners would participate by saying prayers in English at appropriate moments when a bell was rung. Now, at the end of the service, there was a pax bread, a tablet containing a sacred image blessed by the priest, handed around to parishioners to be kissed. And a parishioner would bring a loaf to be divided up and eaten. These fragments of what was once a crucified Christ were found in 1915. They were concealed in the northeast wall of the nave. The crucifix was probably hidden at the time of the Reformation, but by 1915 it had disintegrated due to humidity, and only these two fragments survive as shells. They were kept together by the gesso and paint. They were subsequently, after they'd been found, filled with sawdust and glue, and the nose was restored by the British Museum laboratory in 1960. It shows Christ already dead, with closed eyes and an expression of tranquility. These particular fragments are precious because wooden sculpture rarely survived, even if it wasn't destroyed. If it was buried or hidden, it rotted over the hundreds of years. There must have been thousands in the country because every church had a crucifix. Another example, the one we saw at the beginning, statue of St. Margaret from St. Andrew's Church. It's a 14th century statue. Now, St. Margaret the Virgin, or St. Margaret of Antioch, was a popular saint in England. Perhaps it's because she is said to have promised very powerful indulgences, that is, a way of reducing the punishment for sins, to those who read her life. She is apocryphal. She's described in a book called The Golden Legend, a collection of saints' lives compiled around 1260, so much later. She's normally shown with a dragon, as she's said to have been swallowed by a dragon, but her cross irritated its stomach and she was expelled alive. She was found, this statue was found in a blocked staircase during repairs in the 1980s. The head had been hacked off to prevent eye contact. That was one of the important things for the iconoclasts, that they scored out eyes or knocked off heads, because the eye contact was thought to be a critical point of the image and of worshipping the image. It's an unusual survival, partly because it's fine quality. Thousands of churches must have had images like that in the like this in the late medieval period, but as I said, they've nearly all been destroyed. This is how it was found in a niche that was bricked up. Another example from this one from around the late 14th century. St. Christopher bearing the Christ child. It's found in Norton Priory. It's about, it's quite large. It's about 3.5 metres high. It was commissioned by the Priory. The Priory is near the crossing point of a river, the River Mersey, between Birkenhead and Warrington. An appropriate place for St. Christopher because, again, according to the Golden Legend, he carried the Christ child across a deep stream. And in fact, the name Christopher means Christ bearer. The statue was part of the Priory. It was sold and used as a garden ornament, and that's how it survived destruction. Probably would have been brightly painted. It seems as though it was recovered and restored by Catholics in the 17th century. They are thought to have replaced the head of Christ in the 17th century, which was believed to have been smashed by iconoclasts, and is now in the Merseyside Museum. Another couple of examples from Winchester Cathedral near the Rood Screen. The Madonna and Child on the left is a small piece of limestone. It's 48 centimetres high, probably from the Low Countries, probably about 1475, and there would have been originally thousands of such pieces in churches and cathedrals. The head of God on the right, described recently as magnificent, once stood behind the high altar. You may be wondering about having a representation of God. Back in the 12th century, it was acceptable to represent God simply by a hand. You'll often see a hand appearing, but from the 13th century onwards, it became increasingly acceptable to represent God as a person. And by 1430, it was normal to represent God as a sort of half-length human form, typically with long white hair and a beard in the form you see here. This is a bit later. And both of these sculptures originally formed part of a great screen, a rood screen, unusually behind the high altar. And these statues were found in the rubble. The Winchester rood screen was unusual because normally, as I said, the rood screen separates the nave from the chancel, and in this case there was a rood screen behind the high altar. This is interesting. This is a Jesse tree from St Mary Priory Church in Abergavenny, carved from an oak trunk in the late 15th century. Originally it would have been brightly coloured. Originally the branch coming out of the Jesse's breast, you can just see the beginnings of it in the centre of this picture, would have spread about 25 feet high. This piece, although the Jesse tree was destroyed, this part remaining, you may wonder how that survived. Well, the Priory had a close connection with the Tudors and Henry VIII. It's described as one unarguably great wooden figure to survive the Reformation, making it unique in Britain. The tree of Jesse, by the way, is a depiction in art of the ancestors of Christ. It's a tree which rises from Jesse of Bethlehem, the father of King David. It was originally used as a schematic representation of the genealogy of the ancestors of Christ. It is based on a passage from the book of Isaiah that describes the descent of the Messiah, and the various figures depict the lineage of Jesus. The subject is often seen in Christian art, particularly in the medieval period. The earliest examples from about the 11th century in illuminated manuscripts, and there are examples in medieval psalters and other examples in stained glass windows and stone carvings painted on walls and ceilings. Smaller forms are found in embroideries and ivories. The use of the tree to express a line of descent was in fact adopted by the nobility, and you'll often see in country houses these days the family trees of the nobility going back sometimes to the Norman conquest. The convention for representing the tree of Jesse is normally to show Jesse lying or sleeping with a tree or vine growing out of his side or sometimes his navel. And the ancestors of Christ are shown on the branches. And at the top is typically Mary surmounted by Christ. These are statues of St. Helen and St. Catherine from Ford Abbey in Dorset. They were discovered when digging a drainage ditch in the 1970s. They're 14th century, and the Ford Abbey, the monastic building, had been converted into a grand house, and the church totally demolished after the dissolution of the monasteries. It often happened. The most complete of the statues is St. Helen, about just over a metre high, and it was probably paired with St. Catherine, probably in an altar or in a window of a lady chapel. Now, alabaster carvings like this were either walled up, like the St. Gregory panel from Stoke Charity, or taken to the continent, like this one, the Swansea altarpiece. It's called that because it was purchased by Lord Swansea in Munich in the 1830s. Now, in England, these alabaster pieces were produced in Nottingham because it had a quarry nearby for alabaster, and they were exported all across Europe, particularly France, and most of them are now lost. They were, of course, destroyed during the Reformation, but those that survive were sometimes hidden under flagstones, and sometimes it was because they were taken to the continent. This is another alabaster panel from an altarpiece. It would incidentally have been brightly painted like all the other things that I've been showing you. These alabaster images, we believe, survived the dissolution of the monasteries, but did not survive the reign of King Edward VI, following the Putting Away of Books and Images Act of 1549, which ordered all images to be destroyed. In fact, some 8 months later, the English ambassador to France reported the arrival in France of 3 English ships laden with alabaster images to be sold in Paris, Rouen and elsewhere. We don't know whether those were from the warehouses in Nottingham or had been removed from English churches and smuggled out of the country. This is St. George, hidden under whitewash in St. Gregory's Church in Norfolk. The images were painted onto dry plaster, fresco secco, unlike the wet plaster technique used in Italy. And St. Gregory is shown here. He was famous for some of the finest, as a subject of some of the finest wall paintings in East Anglia. It shows I said St. Gregory, I meant St. George. It's showing St. George killing the dragon. Behind St. George, you can just make out a magnificent city. The princess you can see on the right watching. It's about 12 feet high. It's vibrant with colour still. The horse is staring into the dragon's eyes, a powerful image, and the fragments were found above a window in the south aisle. The main part of the image seems to be a doom painting with Christ seated in judgment. St. George, incidentally, was made patron saint of England in the 14th century by Edward III, but Edward the Confessor remained the traditional patron saint until about 1552, when all saints' banners other than George's were abolished. We come now to doom paintings. The reason these survived is because they were destroyed by being whitewashed, and by very recently, by carefully removing the whitewash, the images underneath have been recovered. This is a Last Judgment. Typically, they are colloquially called a doom painting. It was from above a rood screen. The saved in this one, typically the saved are always shown on the left and the damned on the right. The saved in this one have crowns and mitres, although in other doom paintings kings and bishops are often shown going down to hell. There's a shadow where the statues of Christ and Mary on the left would have been, and St. John the Baptist on the right. It is shown underneath with the 10 Commandments, the Word of God, or sometimes the royal arms. Now, in England, it wasn't angry mobs that destroyed these images, as was often the case on the continent, but it was local bureaucracy. There was a bureaucracy methodically set up across the whole country with lists of churches that they would visit and carry out the destruction item by item. In this church, we know that someone was paid for the rood screen to be repainted and paid for the Christ on the cross to be taken down. So as I say, this wasn't mobs that were doing the destruction. This was a carefully calculated, administratively methodical process. The parish, incidentally, all the parishes were forced to pay for the destruction. A small number were shipped to the continent, as I mentioned, but this was later stopped. This is a close-up of some of the damned being sent down to hell. This is Coventry Holy Trinity Church, another doom painting. There are about 60 doom paintings left in the country. Perhaps this is one of the most renowned. It dates to the 1430s. Sometimes these are also called apocalypse paintings. They were kept on view and became victim to Henry VIII's Reformation because they were considered to be frivolous and they were whitewashed over. It's not so much because it's not like an image of a saint, which was idolatrous, which was because it was worshipped. These were just seen to be unnecessary, and because there were interesting images of people doing strange things, it was all considered to be too frivolous. We don't know exactly, but experts estimate that only about 5% of stained glass windows survived the Reformation. There are a few examples, including St Mary's Church in Fairford, Gloucestershire, where there's as many as 28 windows surviving. They were dismantled and hidden. There's also some in Canterbury Cathedral and York Minster, and this example in Gloucester Cathedral. The central window, I've shown you an enlargement here, includes Christ and the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary is shown crowned and seated on a cushion on a stone seat, and Christ is shown with his right hand raised, blessing the crowned Virgin Mary. It was made in about 1350. The Great East Window, when it was made, was the largest window in the world, and it's still largely intact. It's one of the great examples of medieval English art. The reason it survived is largely, partly it was because of the cost of replacing such a large window, because when stained glass windows were destroyed, they were replaced with plain glass, which of course is expensive. But the other reason is because this window is so large that it was integral to the building's architecture. In other words, there was a danger, if it had been removed, of the building falling down, the cathedral falling. It was constructed following the burial of Edward II, and it shows a hierarchy from earth at the bottom up through the nobility to bishops, then abbots and apostles and angels to God in heaven. We come now to the destruction of books, and this is the Act of 1549, the putting away of books and images. The important clause here is the Book of Common Prayer never to be read, but only the pure word of God. What that means is that it was thought that the Book of Common Prayer was not the word of God and led to superstition and idolatry, and should therefore all the books of common prayer should be destroyed. It doesn't exempt tombs, notice, provided always that this act or anything therein contained shall not extend to any image or picture set or engraven upon any tomb in any church, chapel or churchyard, only for a monument of any dead saint. In other words, I should clarify that anything that showed was a tomb or a monument, a tomb-like structure to a dead saint should be destroyed, but a tomb of a lay person, maybe aristocracy, was exempt, as we've seen earlier. Incidentally, this act was repealed by Mary I, but re-established by James I. And it was reinforced the following year by the Act Against Superstitious Books and Images. So the act meant that if it was a tomb like this one of John Harrington, the 4th Baron Harrington, and his wife Elizabeth Courtenay in Porlock in Somerset, then it survived. It's an art form that survived the Reformation. This, in fact, is a very high quality art, which sometimes was found in parish churches, not just cathedrals. And it's alabaster effigies of the two of them. These images here were believed to have been erected at the expense of Elizabeth's stepdaughter, the great heiress Cicely Bonville, and are considered to be of the highest quality. Some have said befitting a cathedral more than a retired country church. Now, coming back to books, as I said, it was an act for the destruction of books. Principally, or I should say initially, the Book of Common Prayer were all destroyed, although a few remain. But the scale of destruction was then extended essentially to all books. It was vast. It's rarely discussed as an aspect of the Tudor period. There's about 6,000, only 6,000 volumes survive, which you might think sounds a lot, but it's equivalent to about 3 good-sized medieval libraries, and we know there were hundreds of such libraries. Manuscripts were destroyed, sometimes through lack of interest. I'll give you an example. In 1840, in the Victorian period, an antiquarian found his fish had been wrapped with a government document from the reign of James II. And when he inquired further, he found the fishmonger had bought 10 tons of, quotes, waste paper from Somerset House. And it became public knowledge that the Chancellor of the Exchequer had sold priceless documents going back to the reign of Henry VII as scrap paper. Now, Edward VI died of tuberculosis in 1553 and was replaced by the Catholic Mary Tudor. She ordered all images that were destroyed should be replaced in parish churches at the expense of the local parish. Incidentally, this is probably the best known portrait of Mary. It's by the Netherlandish portrait painter Antonio Moore. One of the reasons I'm showing you this is it predates this image. I'm talking now about painting technique. This is Elizabeth I by Stephen van der Merlen, and Mary died in 1558. Elizabeth ordered that all the images that had been recreated under Mary's order should be destroyed again, and again at the cost of the local parish. I was feeling that by this stage these parishes must be feeling slightly peeved. She reinstated the Book of Common Prayer, but she didn't actually cancel the Putting Away of Books and Images Act. She was more concerned with images of herself, as I go into some detail to explain about that in a later talk. Note that this image is less than 10 years after the one we just saw of Mary, and it's entirely different in style. And I think that comparison with the previous one and this later one undermines the argument that these stylized images of Elizabeth were because painting, the artists weren't able to paint in any other way. Painting was still maturing and, quotes, improving. I think that's clearly untrue. That this demonstrates that this rigid, formal style was the preferred style. They didn't want Elizabeth to be painted in the same way as Mary. Now, the Putting Away of Books and Images Act was re-established by James I, and James I and particularly Charles I brought a new view of painting. James I was asked or told bishops to allow crosses and pictures of the apostles. He was a staunch Protestant, by the way, but he wasn't a Puritan. And so he became criticised by both sides, by the Puritans for not being iconoclastic enough, and by many, like the bishops, of not going far enough in allowing images. Charles I was the greatest art patron of any British monarch. He built up one of the greatest collections of paintings including religious paintings across Europe. So we come now, skipping through the first part of the Stuart period, to the Commonwealth and the destruction of what few images remained by that stage. Remember, some had been reinstated and redestroyed and reinstated again. This is the Petition of the Women of Middlesex of 1641, and they allegedly wrote, "We desire that profane glass windows, whose superstitious paint makes many idolaters may be humbled and dashed to pieces against the ground. For our conscience tells us that they are diabolical, and the father of darkness was the inventor of them, being the chief patron of damnable pride." Incidentally, some historians claim that this wasn't a petition by the women of Middlesex. It was a satirical document used to make fun of the of a fashion at the time of what were called mannish women or masculine feminines. It was called at the time a deformity never before dreamt of, and as well as mannish women, there were also womanish men, described at the time as, quotes, "young fellows who decks themselves up in effeminate fashions, are fit faggots for hell." I apologise to modern listeners, but I think it's important to understand the strength of the views at that time. Now, this order of 1641, which was approved by Parliament, called for the removal and abolition of idolatrous images from religious places, and it seems it commanded broad popular support. It wasn't an oath, but an undertaking. It was important as it bound the soul to support Protestant beliefs. It was interpreted at the time as including everything in the church, however long it had been there, that if any image at all was idolatrous in the sight of God and against the scriptures. And the Church of Rome was seen as a corrupting feminine force whose idolatrous images provoked licentiousness. The Roman Church at that time was described as the whore of Babylon from Edward's reign onwards, and the Roman Church was gendered as feminine and the Church of England as masculine. That goes back to the time of Henry VIII. There were many enthusiastic destroyers of art. It was methodical, but the people they employed put their hearts and souls into it, and one of the most fanatic was William Dowsing, known as Basher Dowsing. He wrote of his visit to one church, "We break 130 superstitious pictures." That was April 1643. Fortunately, no other counties apart from Cambridgeshire and Suffolk seem to have had a person like Basher Dowsing of such fanaticism. And many locals didn't support Dowsing. One of the standard replies to Dowsing when he arrived is they couldn't find a ladder. Maybe that's what happened here, bottom left, at Abingdon Pigots, where there is one angel without a defaced face. Now, Dowsing rarely returned to churches. He did sometimes, but rarely. If the wardens of the church had been uncooperative, then he would probably return. He did return to St Mary Ufford on the right here, and records the font cover as glorious like a pope's triple crown. Now that sounds like praise, but it was in fact criticism. The word glorious to him meant pretentious and proud and something to be destroyed. The niches in this font cover are empty. They had statues which were destroyed. The only image to remain is a pelican at the top, pecking its own breast. It was a Catholic image of sacrifice, but it was also an image used by Elizabeth I. So he didn't destroy that, and he didn't order the font cover itself to be destroyed. Or if he did, he never came back to this church. The Eleanor crosses. A bit of background. Queen Eleanor, who was the wife of King Edward I, died near Lincoln in 1290, and he loved her to the extent that he had her body moved to Westminster, and each stopping place where her body rested overnight, he had a cross built. There were 12 crosses altogether, 12 overnight stays on the journey, and there are 3 surviving crosses, including this one in Northampton. In London, there were 2 Eleanor crosses erected, one on Cheapside near the junction with Wood Street, and the final cross near Charing Cross and Trafalgar Square, as it's now called. Now, at the time, Charing Cross was a village near Westminster, just down the road from Westminster. And on the 2nd of May 1643, the Cheapside Cross was demolished, and 3 months after it had been pulled down, the Commons ordered that plain crosses were to be demolished in any open place, whether religious or non-religious. It was claimed that the chairman of the committee for the demolition danced a jig on a piece of stained glass taken down from the new chapel at Westminster. Of course, all such claims were embellished or invented by the royalists when they returned, or exaggerated, so that story may be exaggerated. But the Puritans were accused of beating down all things which smell but of antiquity, out of a desire for innovation and the new. So there's another twist here. It wasn't just that they were idolatrous, it was because they were destroying everything that was old to replace it with the new world, the new Puritan world. The destruction spread. There were then assaults on cathedrals during the 1640s, sometimes by parliamentary soldiers, described as mindless vandalism, the inevitable plunder and pillage of war, as an almost ritualistic destruction of symbols that represent the enemy, the Stuart monarchy. Parliament passed an act to make it clear that churches were not in themselves idolatrous, and an ordinance was passed requiring church buildings to be kept in a state of good repair. This equestrian statue of Charles I has an interesting story, because it was thought to be destroyed but was later restored in 1660. On the site, in fact, of the Eleanor Cross that was at Charing Cross, there, which was destroyed, there was an equestrian statue of Charles I erected by his son Charles II. And the reason it survived is that it had been hidden during the Commonwealth period. It was originally made in 1633 by Hubert Lasure, a French sculptor who was trained in Florence, and it was cast in bronze and destroyed by Parliament in 1649. Now, the person who was ordered by Parliament to destroy it, or paid by Parliament to destroy it, was a metal dealer. And what he did is he buried it in his garden, but cleverly he started to sell cutlery allegedly made from the melted down statue. But he was lying, because he'd hidden the statue in his garden. And during the Restoration, Charles II restoration, he made it known that he had the statue. The statue was dug up and erected in 1675 on, as I said, the site of the Eleanor Cross that had been placed in Charing Cross. Did all destruction end with the Reformation? I've just got a few more examples of continued destruction in various forms. Let me just tell you about one particular example. Sometimes things were destroyed because they were old-fashioned and believed to be worthless. Nonsuch Palace was one example. You can see here an image of Nonsuch Palace, a magnificent palace. No such palace existed in Europe, is why it was called Nonsuch. Built by Henry the Eighth for his son Edward. Queen Mary I sold it, but it was returned to royal hands in the 1590s, and later Charles II gave it to his mistress, Barbara, Countess of Castlemaine. It required a lot of renovation because no one had been looking after it for the previous 100-odd years, and to avoid the cost, she had it pulled down around 1682 and sold off the building materials to pay her gambling debts. And this sort of destruction was common. So many ancient buildings and works of art were lost or destroyed because they were seen as just to be old and worthless. But there's another destruction that was the destruction of London during the Blitz. This is one photograph, so to give you an idea of what London was like. Prior to this, I should mention the Victorians destroyed large parts of London. Although they rebuilt them, they were clearing terrible slums in London and rebuilding parts of London. But this, during the war, large parts of London became bomb sites. In fact, when I was young, there were still large parts of London that remained as bomb sites. And then finally, moving on quickly, a final loss. Since 1900, some 1,200 country houses have been demolished. In fact, by 1955, there was one country house like this demolished every 5 days, described later as a cultural tragedy. To give you one example, this building here, Mentmore, as late as 1975, the British Labour government under James Callaghan refused to save Mentmore, causing the dispersal of its art collection, believed to be the country's finest art collection. And just to show how short-sighted they were, you might be thinking, well, it would have cost a lot of money to save it. The government was offered the house and all of its contents, all of the art, for £2 million. It was strongly argued by Roy Strong, director of the V&A, that they should buy it. 3 years later, the government decided against the £2 million offer, and the contents alone were then sold for £6 million. So the government could have bought it, sold part of the collection and got their money back. During the 1960s, it wasn't until the 1960s that historians and public bodies began to realise the loss to the nation of this destruction. But it wasn't until the 1980s that public opinion changed and the loss became a national disgrace. But thankfully, the National Trust has saved over 500 historic houses, castles, archaeological and industrial monuments, gardens, parks, nature reserves and so on, and opened them all to the public. Which brings me to the end of this talk on the loss of British art and architecture. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to recording my next talk, hopefully more joyful than this talk has been. Just to give you a summary of where I now stand, I'm in, I believe, the final year of my mammoth 6-year project. It started at the beginning of lockdown in March 2020, when I had to stop giving my weekly art history classes and decided to give them at home, record them, and then upload them to YouTube for my class of 30, and it spread from there. I think what I aim at is about 250 talks. These 250 talks, which amount to some 200 hours of the history of Western art, give a brief but I hope interesting and informative overview. Thank you for your time and attention to this talk, and I look forward to giving another talk soon. Goodbye for now.